What if I told you that the real monster in Silent Hill 2 isn't Pyramid Head, or any of the grotesque creatures stalking through the fog? What if the real monster is a quiet, ordinary man in a green jacket who doesn't even realize he's the villain of his own story? James Sunderland stands in front of a dirty bathroom mirror in the opening moments of Silent Hill 2, and he looks exactly like someone you'd forget 5 seconds after passing them on the street. Dirty blonde hair, unremarkable face, tired eyes, 29 years old, works in an office, divorced from reality in ways he can't even begin to comprehend yet, and he's about to walk into one of the most psychologically complex horror experiences ever created, not because the town is calling to him, but because something inside his own mind is screaming to be heard, and he's been covering his ears for so long that it started manifesting as physical nightmare. Here's the thing about James that makes him different from every other survival horror protagonist. He's not fighting for survival. He's not trying to escape. He's not investigating a conspiracy or searching for a cure or trying to save the world. James Sunderland came to Silent Hill voluntarily, following a letter from his dead wife, walking into fog and decay and monsters because somewhere deep in his unconscious mind, he knows he deserves every single terrible thing that's about to happen to him. This is a man on a pilgrimage to his own punishment, and he doesn't even fully understand why yet. Tonight, we're going to dismantle James Sunderland piece by piece. We're talking about repressed memory, pathological guilt, the psychology of mercy killing, dissociative identity, symbolic manifestation of trauma, all of it. I'm using real psychological frameworks here, actual clinical concepts, trauma theory that applies to how minds break and rebuild themselves around unbearable truths. I'll be rating certain psychological traits on a severity scale from 1 to 5, where 1 is mild and 5 is as extreme as it gets, completely defining every choice this character makes. This is going to be a long journey, so settle in, get comfortable, dim the lights if you need to. We're about to explore why James Sunderland is one of the most psychologically realistic portrayals of guilt and self-destruction horror gaming has ever created, and why his journey through Silent Hill is really just a journey through the architecture of his own fractured mind. Let's start with the lie he's built everything on, the impossible letter. James receives a letter from Mary, his wife Mary, who he tells us died 3 years ago from a terminal illness. Let that sit with you for a moment. His wife has been dead for 3 years, and he's holding a letter he claims she wrote. She's telling him to meet her in Silent Hill, in their special place, where they made happy memories together. She's waiting for him there. Come find me, the letter says. I'm here in our special place. Now, most people, when they receive communication from deceased loved ones, recognize immediately that something is wrong with this picture. Grief can be powerful, can make you see signs and feel presences and find meaning in coincidences, but actually receiving a physical letter from someone 3 years dead, that breaks reality in ways that should trigger immediate alarm bells. But James doesn't question it. Or rather, he questions it just enough to acknowledge that yes, Mary is dead. Yes, this doesn't make logical sense. Yes, something is strange here, and then he gets in his car and drives hours to Silent Hill anyway. This tells us something crucial about James's psychological state before he even enters the town. He's operating on 2 levels of consciousness that shouldn't be able to coexist. The surface level acknowledges reality. Mary died. Mary is gone. This letter can't really be from her. But the deeper level, the level that's actually driving his behavior, doesn't care about logic or possibility or the laws of nature. That level needs Mary to be in Silent Hill, needs there to be a chance, however impossible, that she's still reachable somehow. needs a reason to make this journey because the alternative, sitting alone in his apartment with the full weight of Mary's death and everything that surrounds it, is more unbearable than walking into obvious danger. This is cognitive dissonance at a pathological level. Severity rating 5 out of 5. This is maxed out. Cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort from holding contradictory beliefs simultaneously. And normally, the human mind resolves this quickly by changing one belief or finding rationalization. James doesn't resolve it, he lives inside the contradiction. She's dead and she's alive. I buried her and I'm going to find her. She's gone forever and she's waiting for me in our special place. These opposites coexist in James's mind, creating a fractured relationship with reality that makes him psychologically vulnerable to everything Silent Hill is about to do to him. Because here's the thing about Silent Hill, based on the established lore of the series. The town isn't random. It's not just a spooky place where bad things happen to whoever wanders in. Silent Hill has a metaphysical quality, something in its history and the cult activities and the spiritual wrongness baked into its foundations that makes it respond to the darkness in people. It reads guilt, trauma, repressed memory, psychological fracture, and it manifests those internal states as external reality. The monsters you fight are symbols from your psyche. The locations you explore trigger buried memories. The puzzles you solve are cognitive locks on truths you've hidden from yourself. For James, this means Silent Hill becomes a landscape of everything he's refusing to face. Every fog-shrouded street is confusion and obscured truth. Every decaying building is the rot inside his own heart. Every creature crawling toward him is some aspect of his guilt and self-loathing made flesh. The town isn't punishing him exactly. It's holding up a mirror. It's forcing confession. It's therapy conducted through nightmare, where the only way out is through complete psychological honesty. And James has built his entire presence here on fundamental dishonesty with himself. The letter becomes his anchor through all of this. He pulls it out periodically, reads Mary's words, uses it as justification to keep going when everything around him is screaming that he should turn back. As long as he has the letter, he has purpose. As long as Mary's words exist on that paper, the possibility of finding her remains alive. The letter functions as what psychology calls a transitional object, like a security blanket for a child facing separation anxiety. It's something tangible he can hold on to when reality becomes too threatening, too confusing, too confrontational. But here's the devastating part, and you might want to pay attention to this because it sets up everything that follows. Have you ever convinced yourself to believe something you knew wasn't true because the alternative was too painful to face? Maybe you've stayed in a dying relationship because admitting it was over meant accepting failure or facing loneliness. Maybe you've ignored symptoms of illness because acknowledging them meant confronting your own vulnerability and mortality. Maybe you've told yourself you're fine, everything is fine, this is fine, while your life gradually falls apart around you. We all engage in motivated reasoning sometimes, where we believe what we want to believe rather than what evidence clearly shows us. James is doing this, but amplified to nightmare levels. He's not just ignoring uncomfortable truths or rationalizing minor contradictions. He's constructed an entire alternate reality that requires him to journey into a town that exists half in the real world and half in psychological metaphor, where he'll be attacked by physical manifestations of his own guilt and trauma. He's chosen to believe an impossible letter from a dead woman because the alternative, facing the full truth of Mary's death and his role in it, is so unbearable that walking into literal horror is preferable. Think about that calculus for a moment. Think about what it means that James would rather fight monsters would rather navigate through decrepit hospitals and prisons and hotels filled with creatures trying to kill him, would rather face Pyramid Head, would rather experience every terrible thing Silent Hill is about to put him through than sit quietly in a room and remember the truth of what happened with Mary. That tells you everything about how severe his psychological fracture is. That tells you how deep the guilt goes, how complete the repression is, how desperately his mind has worked to bury certain memories so deep that he's forgotten he's even hiding something. This is what I'm calling foundational denial, and it's the engine driving everything in Silent Hill 2. Without this level of denial, there is no story. James would see the letter, recognize it as grief-induced delusion or someone's cruel prank, maybe seek therapy for his continuing struggles with bereavement, and gradually, painfully work through Mary's death using normal psychological processes. He'd mourn, he'd rage, he'd feel guilty about whatever he did or didn't do while she was sick. He'd eventually accept her absence and start rebuilding his life. That's the healthy path. That's how grief is supposed to work. But James can't do that because what he's hiding from himself isn't just normal grief. It's not just the sadness of losing a spouse to terminal illness or the guilt of surviving when someone you love didn't. What James is hiding is so much darker, so much more transgressive, so fundamentally shattering to his self-concept that his entire psychological structure has organized around keeping it buried. And Silent Hill, responding to that buried darkness, is about to spend the entire game forcing him to excavate it, layer by layer, monster by monster, memory by memory, until he finally faces what he came here pretending he didn't know. The letter that shouldn't exist is really a letter James wrote to himself, permission from the dead to go searching for punishment. And every step he takes into Silent Hill is a step deeper into his own mind, into corridors of guilt and shame and self-loathing that he's locked away for so long that they've become architectural. The fog isn't just weather, it's the obscurity he's maintained around his own memories. The rust and decay on every surface isn't just aesthetic, it's the corruption eating away at his sense of self. The monsters aren't random threats, they're fragments of his psyche that have become hostile because they've been denied and repressed for so long. James Sunderland walks into Silent Hill holding an impossible letter, and what he doesn't understand yet is that he's really walking into himself. The town is his confession waiting to be spoken. Every horror is a truth demanding acknowledgement, and the only way he leaves, if he leaves at all, is by finally opening his eyes to what he's been refusing to see since before the game even started. That's where we are. That's the foundation. Now let's talk about who James actually is beneath the denial, the architecture of ordinariness. One of the most psychologically brilliant choices in James's character design is how aggressively normal he is. This isn't Leon Kennedy flipping through windows and roundhouse kicking zombies. This isn't Chris Redfield with military training and the physical build of someone who punches boulders. James is a 29-year-old clerk. He works, or worked, at some small company doing paperwork. He's not particularly strong, not particularly brave, not particularly skilled at anything that would help in a survival situation. He's average height, average build, average appearance. He dresses like someone who shops at department stores and doesn't think much about fashion. Green jacket, khaki pants, boots, practical, unremarkable, forgettable. And this ordinariness is crucial to understanding his psychology because it means James has no exceptional resources to draw on when reality starts breaking down. He doesn't have training that taught him how to handle extreme stress. He doesn't have physical prowess that gives him confidence in dangerous situations. He doesn't have any specialized knowledge about Silent Hill or the occult or psychological horror. He's just a regular person, which means every horrible thing he encounters hits him with full force, unfiltered by any protective layer of expertise or capability. This creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, where repeated exposure to uncontrollable negative events leads to a state of passive acceptance. When you can't fight effectively, can't run fast enough, can't understand what's happening or why, you start to internalize the belief that you're powerless to change your circumstances. Most horror protagonists fight against this, maintain agency, struggle to survive and escape. James does struggle, but there's something subtly different in his responses. He moves through Silent Hill with a kind of resigned acceptance. He encounters impossible things and barely reacts. He fights when he has to, but doesn't seem to expect victory. He reads documents explaining disturbing lore and just processes it and moves on. This subdued, almost passive quality in James's behavior reveals something about his psychological state. He's not surprised by horror. He's not outraged by impossibility. On some level, he expected this. On some level, he feels like he deserves this. The learned helplessness isn't just from encountering monsters in Silent Hill. It's from something earlier, something in his life before the game starts, that taught him he was powerless to control important outcomes, and that terrible things happening to him made sense within some internal moral framework he's operating from. Let's talk about James's relationship with violence, because it's psychologically revealing. He's not good at fighting. His movements are awkward, hesitant. He swings weapons like someone who's never been in a physical confrontation before, and yet he kills repeatedly, brutally, whatever comes at him. The nurses, the abstract monsters, even Pyramid Head when given the opportunity. There's no pleasure in it, but there's also no moral crisis. He doesn't question whether these creatures can be reasoned with, or spared, or avoided. He just hits them until they stop moving. This reveals a utilitarian approach to violence that suggests deep, emotional numbness. Severity rating for emotional affect, 4 out of 5. James is seriously disconnected from normal emotional responses to extreme situations. When you watch him play out, controlling him through the game, you realize how little he reacts to things that should provoke strong emotion. He finds horrifying scenes and mutters brief observations. He witnesses impossible transformations and just accepts them. He walks through locations saturated with death and decay and comments minimally, analytically, without much feeling. This isn't bravery or stoicism, it's dissociation. James is experiencing psychological detachment from his immediate sensory and emotional experience as a defense mechanism against trauma. The trauma isn't just what's happening in Silent Hill currently. The trauma is what happened before, with Mary during her illness and death, that James hasn't processed. His emotional responses have been muted, numbed, disconnected from events because connecting to them, really feeling them, would mean feeling everything else too. It would mean feeling the guilt, the shame, the horror of whatever he did or didn't do. So he walks through Nightmare with the emotional range of someone reading a mildly interesting newspaper article, and that very lack of affect tells us how severely traumatized he actually is. Let's talk about his voice, because this matters psychologically. James speaks in a flat monotone through most of the game. His delivery is wooden, almost robotic. Now, some of this is the voice acting limitations of 2001, but it also works perfectly as characterization. When people experience severe dissociation, their vocal affect flattens. They speak without much prosody or emotional coloring because they're not connecting to the emotional content of what they're saying. James talks about Mary's death in the same tone he uses to describe puzzles or comment on the environment. Everything is delivered with the same low energy, disconnected quality because his emotions are walled off from his conscious experience. This creates a sense of unreality that permeates James's entire journey. He's not fully present in his own life. He's going through motions, following the next objective, doing what needs to be done without integrating the experience into a coherent emotional narrative. This is what happens when reality becomes too painful to fully inhabit. You create distance between your conscious awareness and your actual experience, observing your own life from behind a psychological barrier that protects you from feeling too much. Have you ever gone through something so stressful or traumatic that you felt like you were watching it happen to someone else? Like you were floating outside your body, observing yourself go through motions without really being present in them? That's dissociation, and it's one of the mind's most powerful defense mechanisms against unbearable experiences. James is living in that state continuously. He's been dissociated since before the game even starts, operating on autopilot through his grief and guilt, and Silent Hill is exploiting that disconnection, forcing him back into feeling, back into presence, back into the truth of his own experience. His ordinariness also means James has no heroic identity to maintain. He's not trying to be brave or strong or capable. He's not protecting his self-image as a warrior or survivor. He can just be broken, confused, lost, without it contradicting any sense of who he's supposed to be, and this makes him psychologically vulnerable in ways that more capable protagonists aren't. When Leon Kennedy fights bioweapons, he's in his element, doing what he was trained for. When James Sunderland fights manifestations of his own guilt, he has no framework for understanding what's happening or how to protect himself psychologically. This vulnerability creates a kind of psychological porousness where Silent Hill's influence can seep into James's mind more easily. He has no strong barriers, no clear sense of self to defend, no deeply held beliefs about his own goodness or worth that would contradict the accusations his environment is making. When the town says, "You're guilty," when the monsters embody his shame, when the locations trigger buried memories, James doesn't have the psychological resources to say, "No, that's not me. I'm a good person. I deserve better than this." Instead, some part of him whispers, "Yes, this is exactly what I deserve." And that agreement, that internal acceptance of punishment as deserved, is what keeps him moving forward into deeper horror instead of turning around and leaving. James doesn't try very hard to escape Silent Hill. He doesn't look for authorities, doesn't try to call for help, doesn't make plans to get back to his car and drive away. He just keeps following the next breadcrumb, searching for Mary, moving deeper into the psychological labyrinth because some part of him, buried beneath the denial and dissociation, knows he needs to finish this, needs to face what he's done, needs to receive whatever judgment is waiting at the end of this journey. This is passive suicidality in action. Severity ratings 4 out of 5. James isn't actively trying to kill himself, isn't seeking out death directly, but he's placing himself in situations where death is likely and not taking adequate steps to protect himself. He's not trying very hard to survive. He's accepting danger with resignation, almost with relief, because death would solve the problem of having to continue living with what he's done. The architecture of his ordinariness, then, becomes the architecture of his vulnerability. Because he's just some guy, he has no defenses against what Silent Hill is doing to him. Because he has no special capabilities, he can't fight his way through to easy answers. Because he's emotionally shut down, he can't use feelings as a guide to what's real or important. Because he's dissociated from his own experience, he can barely distinguish between external threat and internal manifestation. James Sunderland is the perfect victim for Silent Hill's particular brand of psychological horror because there's nothing exceptional about him to get in the way of complete psychological dismantling. And that dismantling is just beginning. Let's talk about what James is actually searching for. The ghost of Mary Shepard Sunderland Mary is the emotional core of Silent Hill 2. But here's what makes the psychology fascinating. Mary is dead. She's been dead for 3 years, according to James. But she's also the most present character in the game, haunting every moment, every location, every monster, every encounter. She's simultaneously absent and omnipresent, gone forever and more real than anything else in the game. Understanding James's psychology requires understanding his relationship with Mary, both the real woman who died and the ghost he's constructed from memory and guilt. Let's start with who Mary actually was. Mary Shepard Sunderland was James's wife. They met, fell in love, got married, built a life together. They had happy times, took trips together, visited Silent Hill and stayed at a hotel there, created the kind of memories that define a good relationship. Mary was beautiful, according to James's descriptions and the photos we see. She had a warmth about her, a vibrancy. She laughed, she smiled, she made James happy. This is the Mary that James remembers when he's lost in nostalgia, the Mary of the letter and the special place and the good times. But then Mary got sick. Terminal illness, some form of degenerative disease that the game never names specifically but describes in enough detail to understand its horror. She was sick for 3 years. 3 years of declining health, of pain, of watching someone you love deteriorate physically and mentally. 3 years of caregiving, of doctor visits and medications and hopelessness. 3 years of knowing she was dying, that there was no cure, that everything you did was just prolonging the inevitable while she suffered. And Mary during this illness changed. She became bitter, angry, sometimes cruel. She lashed out at James. She said things she didn't mean, or maybe she meant them. It's hard to say. She oscillated between desperate need for James's presence and resentful anger at his health, his freedom, his ability to continue living while she was trapped in a dying body. This is realistic, psychologically accurate portrayal of terminal illness. When you're in that much pain for that long, when you've lost your autonomy and dignity and future, when you're completely dependent on others and watching yourself become a burden, rage and bitterness aren't character flaws. They're natural human responses to unbearable circumstances. But for James, trying to care for someone he loved while she transformed from his waif into this suffering, angry stranger, the psychological toll was severe. Caregiver burden is well documented in psychology. The stress, exhaustion, emotional depletion, the grief that starts before the person even dies because you're watching them disappear gradually, the guilt when you feel resentment toward them for being sick, for needing so much, for saying cruel things even though you know they're in pain, the confusion when you don't know whether the person saying these things is your wife or the illness speaking through her. James experienced something called ambiguous loss during Mary's illness. This is a type of loss where someone is physically present but psychologically absent, or where the relationship has fundamentally changed but there's no clear ending point. Mary was alive but not really Mary anymore. She was his wife but also a stranger made of pain and medication and deteriorating cognitive function. He was losing her gradually, but she hadn't died yet, so the grief had no resolution. This creates profound psychological disorientation because you can't move forward, but you also can't stay in place. You're suspended in perpetual loss. And somewhere during those 3 years, James's feelings changed. This is the dark heart of his psychology that Silent Hill is built around, so pay close attention here. During those 3 years of her illness, James stopped loving Mary. or rather, the love got buried under exhaustion and resentment and grief and horror at what she'd become. He started wishing she would die, started fantasizing about her death as release, as solution, as the only way this unbearable situation could end. And then, in a moment that the game slowly reveals through its narrative, James's wishes became action. This is where we have to talk about mercy killing and the severe psychological complexity of what James did. The game eventually reveals, through fragmented memories and confessions, that James killed Mary. He smothered her with a pillow while she was bedridden, ending her suffering and his burden simultaneously. This is the truth that James has repressed so completely that he's rewritten his entire timeline. Mary got sick 3 years ago, that much is true, but she didn't die 3 years ago from the illness like James remembers. She died very recently within the past week or so, and James killed her. His mind has conflated when she became ill with when she died, creating a false 3 year gap of grieving that never actually happened. The psychology of mercy killing is incredibly complex, and James embodies all that complexity. On one level, if Mary was truly suffering with no hope of recovery, ending her pain could be seen as an act of compassion. This is the framework of assisted suicide debates, of right to die advocacy, of arguments that forcing someone to continue living through unbearable suffering is itself a form of cruelty. And some part of James probably believed he was being merciful, probably told himself he was doing it for her, to release her from pain, to grant her the peace that medicine couldn't provide. But psychological honesty, the kind that Silent Hill demands, requires acknowledging the other truth sitting alongside that mercy. James also did it for himself. He did it because he was exhausted, because he wanted his life back, because he couldn't stand being her caregiver anymore, because he wanted her gone. There was selfishness tangled up with the mercy, resentment mixed with compassion, and that mixture is what makes it psychologically unbearable for James to face directly. Because if he killed Mary purely from compassion, purely to end her suffering, he could potentially integrate that into his self-concept. He could mourn her, feel guilty but also justified, eventually find some psychological resolution. But because he knows somewhere in his unconscious mind that he also wanted to kill her for selfish reasons, that he was as much perpetrator as merciful husband, he can't face it directly. The guilt isn't just about taking action, it's about the motivations behind the action, the relief he felt when she was finally gone, the freedom he experienced after years of being trapped in caregiver role. This creates what psychologists call moral injury, distinct from but related to trauma. Moral injury occurs when you participate in or witness events that violate your deeply held moral beliefs and expectations about yourself or the world. It shatters your sense of yourself as a good person. It creates profound guilt, shame, and spiritual crisis that doesn't resolve through normal coping mechanisms. James killed his wife. This fact, once admitted, destroys his entire self-concept. He can't be the ordinary, decent man in the green jacket and also be someone who murdered his terminally ill wife. Those identities can't coexist, so his mind fractures them. It buries the murder so deep that he genuinely doesn't consciously remember doing it. It creates false memory that Mary died 3 years ago from illness, giving him time to grieve normally, to process her loss through socially acceptable channels. It constructs the impossible letter as permission to return to Silent Hill, not to find Mary alive, but to find the truth about her death and his role in it, to finally face what he's done and accept whatever punishment is waiting. Have you ever done something you're so ashamed of that you can barely stand to think about it? Something that, when the memory surfaces, you immediately push it back down because facing it means facing something terrible about yourself. Maybe it's a betrayal, a lie that destroyed someone's life, a moment of cruelty you can never take back. The impulse is to not think about it, to pretend it didn't happen or wasn't that bad, to construct alternative narratives where you had better reasons or where it wasn't really your fault. That's what James is doing, but with something so severe that normal repression isn't enough. He's rewritten history in his own mind, convinced himself of an alternate timeline, because the real timeline contains a version of himself he cannot accept. Mary's ghost, then, isn't supernatural, it's psychological. She haunts James because guilt haunts people who've committed transgressive acts, especially against those they loved. Every room in Silent Hill triggers memories of her. Every puzzle seems to connect somehow to their relationship. Every monster embodies some aspect of his feelings about her, her illness, his role as both caregiver and killer. The town has read James's buried guilt and constructed an entire reality out of it, forcing him to encounter Mary again and again in different forms until he finally remembers the truth. And the letter, the impossible letter from the dead wife, is really James's unconscious mind giving himself permission to undertake this psychological journey. It's his guilt writing itself an invitation to confession. It's the part of him that knows he can't live with what he's done, that can't keep the memory buried forever, that needs to face truth even though facing it will destroy everything he believes about himself. The letter calls him to Silent Hill not because Mary is there, but because the truth about Mary is there, waiting to be excavated from his own fractured psyche. Mary's presence in Silent Hill 2, constant and omnipresent despite her death, represents the inescapability of guilt. You can bury the memory, rewrite the history, convince yourself you've moved on, but the guilt remains, coloring everything, making true peace impossible. James came to Silent Hill because living with unacknowledged guilt was becoming unbearable. Better to face the monster in the mirror than continue pretending the monster doesn't exist. Severity rating for guilt, 5 out of 5. This is maximally severe, existential guilt that calls into question James's entire moral worth as a human being. This isn't guilt over minor wrongs or mistakes. This is guilt over taking the life of someone vulnerable and dependent on his care, someone he vowed to love in sickness and health, someone whose trust he betrayed at her most helpless moment. This level of guilt doesn't diminish over time. It doesn't fade or become manageable through normal coping strategies. It grows, metastasizes, consumes everything until the person carrying it either faces it completely or destroys themselves trying to keep it contained. James is trying to face it, but he needs Silent Hill's nightmare architecture to break down his defenses enough to let the memory through. And every step deeper into town is a step closer to that devastating moment of recognition when he finally remembers what he's done and can't deny it anymore. Let's talk about what happens when guilt becomes monsters. The manifestations, monsters as psychology, Silent Hill 2's creatures aren't random. They aren't just scary designs meant to create tension and provide enemies to fight. Every single monster in the game is a symbolic manifestation of something in James's psyche, some fragment of his guilt or desire or repressed memory made flesh. Understanding what these creatures represent is crucial to understanding James's internal psychological landscape. Let's start with the lying figures, those writhing, straitjacket-bound creatures that spray acidic vomit. These are usually the first enemies James encounters in Silent Hill, and they set the tone for everything that follows. The lying figures are bound, constrained, unable to move freely. They're trapped in their own bodies, which is exactly how Mary was during her illness. bedridden, unable to walk or care for herself, trapped in a body that had become a prison. The straitjacket imagery suggests restraint, but also mental illness, the blurred line between physical and psychological suffering. But there's another layer here. The lying figures also represent James's own repression, his own psychological restraint. He's bound up his memories and guilt so tightly that they've become distorted, grotesque. When these things attack him, it's his own repressed content trying to force itself into consciousness, trying to break through the psychological restraints he's placed on his own truth. The acid they spray is the corrosive nature of repressed guilt, how keeping things hidden gradually eats away at psychological integrity. The mannequins are even more psychologically revealing. These are two pairs of legs fused together at the waist, creating creatures that are incomplete, fragmented, more sexualized body parts than whole beings. They represent objectification, the reduction of Mary from complete person to just her body, specifically the sexual aspects of her body. During her illness, Mary's body was present, but she wasn't really there as a whole person anymore. James's relationship with her became caretaking, dealing with bodily functions and medical needs, and somewhere in that process the intimacy of marriage was lost. Mary ceased being his wife and became a body he had to maintain. But the mannequins also represent James's sexual frustration during Mary's years of illness. This is uncomfortable to discuss, but psychologically crucial. James is a man in his late 20s whose wife was bedridden and terminally ill for 3 years. Sexual intimacy was impossible during that time. His needs didn't disappear just because Mary was sick, but expressing those needs or acknowledging frustration would have seemed monstrous given her condition. So those feelings got repressed too, buried alongside everything else, and now they're crawling around Silent Hill as incomplete, grotesque representations of sexuality, divorced from intimacy or wholeness. The bubblehead nurses are probably the most discussed monsters in Silent Hill 2, and for good reason. They wear provocative nursing uniforms. Their heads are covered in swollen, pulsating flesh that obscures their faces, and they appear primarily in Brookhaven Hospital, where Mary received treatment. On the surface level, they represent the nurses who cared for Mary, the medical professionals James encountered repeatedly during her illness. But symbolically, they embody the confusion of attraction and revulsion, sexualization and medical care that James experienced during those hospital visits. Here's the psychological complexity. James was around attractive nurses while his wife was dying. This is a completely normal situation. Hospitals employ nurses, many of whom are women, some of whom are conventionally attractive. But for a man whose wife is terminally ill and who hasn't had sexual intimacy in years, being around women in general, and particularly women in somewhat intimate caretaking roles, creates uncomfortable feelings. You're grieving, you're devoted to your dying wife, and yet you notice an attractive person and feel attraction, and then you feel guilt over feeling attraction because how dare you think about anyone else when Mary is suffering. The bubblehead nurses with their obscured faces represent the dehumanization James had to perform to deal with these feelings. He couldn't acknowledge the nurses as whole people with faces and personalities because that would mean acknowledging his attraction to them, which would mean acknowledging his sexual frustration, which would mean acknowledging his resentment toward Mary for being sick. So he fragmented them into bodies without identities, objects without humanity. And now they're hunting him through the hospital, weapons in hand. And he has to kill these representations of his own confused sexuality and guilt over feeling desire while his wife was dying. The bubblehead nurses also represent something more disturbing. Their swollen, pulsating heads are often interpreted as representing disease, the malignant growth of Mary's illness, or possibly sexual imagery, phallic symbolism that relates to James's own sexuality. Either reading works psychologically. They're creatures that combine healing and harm, attraction and disgust, need and guilt, all the impossible contradictions James experienced during Mary's illness made into physical form. Then there's Pyramid Head, and we need to spend significant time on this creature because it's central to understanding James's psychology. Pyramid Head appears as a massive humanoid figure wearing a sharp-edged pyramid-shaped helmet that completely obscures his head. He carries an enormous blade that he drags behind him, creating the iconic scraping sound that announces his presence. He's slow but unstoppable, pursuing James relentlessly through key moments of the game. And in one infamous scene, he sexually assaults other monsters while James watches hidden. Pyramid Head represents James's need for punishment. Severity rating for self-punishing ideation 5 out of 5. This is as severe as it gets. James has committed what he perceives as an unforgivable act, and some part of his psyche believes he deserves to suffer for it, deserves to be hunted and caught and killed. Pyramid Head is that impulse made manifest. He's James's guilt-given form and weapon and relentless purpose. He's not trying to make James face truth or gain insight. He's trying to execute James, to deliver the death sentence that James believes he's earned. The pyramid helmet is psychologically significant because it obscures vision and distorts perception, much like James's own denial obscures truth. But it's also a device of torture, heavy and constrictive and sharp-edged. Pyramid Head is torturing himself by wearing it, just as James is torturing himself by repressing his memories and carrying impossible guilt. The helmet makes Pyramid Head blind, just as James's repression makes him blind to his own truth. They're mirrors of each other, perpetrator and executioner, killer and killed, the same person divided into hunter and prey. The sexual violence Pyramid Head performs in front of James represents the most disturbing aspects of James's own psyche that he can't acknowledge. During the scene where Pyramid Head assaults the mannequins, James watches but doesn't intervene, locked in a closet, forced to witness but not participate. This represents James's own relationship with his sexuality and violence, the dark impulses he has but won't claim as his own. By creating Pyramid Head as a separate entity, James can externalize these aspects of himself, project them onto a monster, and then say, "That's not me, that's something else entirely." But Pyramid Head is James. The game makes this increasingly clear as it progresses. Pyramid Head appears when James is close to remembering something crucial, when his defenses are weakening. Pyramid Head doesn't hurt other people in Silent Hill, only James and the other manifestations from James's psyche. Pyramid Head is part of the same psychological ecosystem as all the other monsters, all of them fragments from James's mind attacking each other, playing out internal conflicts in external space. And here's the devastating psychological truth. James can't kill Pyramid Head. He can drive him away temporarily, but Pyramid Head keeps returning because you can't kill your own guilt. You can't destroy your own need for punishment by fighting it externally. The only way Pyramid Head's story ends, depending on which ending James earns, is when James either fully accepts his guilt and Pyramid Head's purpose is complete, or when James refuses to accept punishment and finds another resolution. But as long as James is in psychological limbo, denying what he did but feeling guilty about it, Pyramid Head will keep hunting him because that's what embodied guilt does. It hunts, it pursues, it never stops until you face what you've done and consciously choose what comes next. Have you ever felt like you were being hunted by your own thoughts, like something dark in your mind was chasing you, and no matter how fast you ran or where you hid, it was always there, getting closer? That's what anxiety and guilt do when they're severe enough. They become their own entity in your psychology, hunting you through every moment, and the only escape is to turn around and face them directly. James is trying to outrun Pyramid Head, but Pyramid Head is just James chasing himself, guilt pursuing the man who's trying to forget he has reason to feel guilty. The abstract daddy is another crucial manifestation, encountered in the Toluca prison section of the game. This creature appears as two bodies fused together in a frame, one on top of the other in a position suggesting sexual assault or domination. This isn't James's monster, not exactly. This is Angela's monster, a manifestation of her trauma from sexual abuse by her father. But James encounters it because Silent Hill is creating a shared psychological space where everyone's nightmares intersect. But James's ability to see and fight Angela's monsters tells us something important about his psychology. He's not experiencing purely his own guilt and trauma. He's experiencing something archetypal, something that touches on broader themes of violation, guilt, power dynamics, the horror of love corrupted into harm. Angela was harmed by a father who was supposed to protect her. Mary was harmed by a husband who was supposed to care for her. These situations parallel each other. Both involve betrayal of protective relationship, violation of trust, harm inflicted by the person who should have provided safety. When James fights the abstract daddy, he's fighting through his recognition that what he did to Mary places him in the same psychological category as Angela's abusive father. He violated his protective role. He used his power over someone vulnerable to harm them. The specific acts are different, but the structural betrayal is the same. And this recognition that he's not the hero of this story, but potentially the monster, is part of what makes his guilt so unbearable. All of these monsters, every creature James encounters in Silent Hill, are fragments of his psyche attacking him, because the psyche that's been fractured and repressed will eventually turn hostile. When you bury trauma and guilt, it doesn't disappear. It festers, becomes toxic, starts poisoning everything. Eventually, it has to be dealt with, and if you won't deal with it consciously, it will force its way into consciousness through symptoms, through nightmares, through breakdowns, through violence directed inward or outward. James's journey through Silent Hill is really a journey through his own internal landscape that's become so poisoned by guilt that it's trying to kill him. Every monster is a part of himself he's refused to acknowledge, now made hostile through repression. The only way to survive isn't to keep fighting them externally, it's to face what they represent internally, to reintegrate the split off parts of his psyche, to acknowledge the full truth of what he did, and why, and what it means about who he is. This is shadow work in psychological terms, the Jungian concept of confronting the dark parts of yourself that you've denied and hidden. The shadow isn't evil exactly, it's just everything you've decided isn't compatible with your conscious self-image. For James, his shadow contains the truth that he's a killer, that he was capable of murdering his wife, that he felt relief when she died, that he's sexually frustrated and resentful, and not purely the devoted husband he wants to believe he was. These aren't comfortable truths, but they're true nonetheless, and Silent Hill is dragging them out of the shadows and forcing James to look at them directly. Every fight with every monster is really James fighting himself, trying to keep these truths at bay. But he can't win by fighting. He can only win by stopping the fight, by lowering his defenses, by saying, yes, this is me, these are my feelings, this is what I did, I accept it all as mine. That's the only path to psychological integration, to healing, to possibly leaving Silent Hill with his sanity intact. But getting to that acceptance requires him to go deeper first, to explore every corner of his guilt and memory until there's nowhere left to hide. So let's follow him into those locations and see what each one reveals about his fractured mind. Part 2 of 3, Locations as Memory. The geography of guilt. Silent Hill isn't just a town. For James, it's a psychological landscape where every location corresponds to some aspect of his relationship with Mary, her illness, and her death. The game takes him through apartments, a hospital, a prison, and a hotel, each one peeling back another layer of repression, triggering more buried memories, forcing him closer to complete recollection. Let's walk through these locations and decode what they represent in James's mind. The apartment buildings James explores early in the game represent ordinary life, domesticity, the everyday existence he shared with Mary before her illness. But these apartments are decaying, full of locked doors and dead ends, some rooms pristine while others are rotting from water damage and neglect. This fragmentation represents how James's memories of his normal life with Mary have become inaccessible and distorted. He can remember some things perfectly, fragments of happy times, but other memories are locked away or corrupted, and he can't quite figure out how to access them anymore. The apartments are where James encounters other people who've been drawn to Silent Hill by their own traumas. Angela Orozco, Eddie Dombrowski, Laura, each of them represents a different response to guilt and trauma, different paths James could take, and interacting with them forces James to consider his own psychology in contrast to theirs. But we'll get to those characters soon. For now, what matters is that the apartments establish the baseline. This is what normal life looks like when it's been abandoned and left to rot. This is what happens when you can't go home again because home was built on assumptions and relationships that no longer exist. Then James enters Brookhaven Hospital, and this is where the game's psychology becomes explicitly about Mary's illness and James's experience as her caregiver. Hospitals are already liminal, anxiety inducing spaces for most people. They're where we go when our bodies betray us, where we're prodded and scanned and reduced to symptoms and diagnoses. For James, hospitals are where he spent countless hours over 3 years, watching Mary deteriorate, talking to doctors who had no answers, navigating sterile corridors while his wife suffered in a bed that might as well have been her coffin. Brookhaven is abandoned, at least in the version James experiences, but it's full of traces of Mary, documents that seem to reference her case, rooms that trigger fragmented memories, and of course, it's full of the bubblehead nurses, those representations of confused sexuality and medical care. Moving through the hospital forces James to relive his time there, the helplessness he felt, the way hospitals rob you of agency and make you wait passively, while experts discuss things you can't fully understand. There's a particularly devastating moment in Brookhaven where James finds a videotape, and you just know, watching him pick it up, that this tape contains something crucial, something buried, something that will shatter whatever fragile narrative he's constructed. But he doesn't watch it immediately. He pockets it, continues exploring, because even now, even as he's actively searching for truth, he's also avoiding truth. The tape is Chekhov's gun, psychologically speaking. It's been introduced, which means it will have to discharge eventually, but James controls the timing of when he faces what's on it. The hospital also contains one of the game's most memorable puzzle sequences involving a music box and a jewelry box and a ring that belonged to Mary. The ring is still in its box, which could suggest James never removed it after Mary died, never symbolically accepted their marriage was over. Or it could suggest he removed it from her hand after killing her and hasn't been able to bring himself to look at it since. Either way, the ring represents the covenant of their marriage, the vows he made, specifically the in sickness and in health part that he ultimately violated by ending her sickness through killing her. After the hospital comes Toluca Prison, and this is where Silent Hill's symbolism becomes less subtle and more directly about judgment and punishment. Prisons are where we send people who've committed crimes, where society enacts justice, where freedom is taken away as consequence for transgression. James's journey through the prison represents his growing acknowledgement that he's guilty of something, that he deserves to be confined and judged, that he's not the victim in this story but the perpetrator. The prison is claustrophobic, dark, full of narrow cells and locked gates. This mirrors the psychological confinement James has created for himself through repression. He's imprisoned in his own mind, locked into patterns of thought and behavior that keep him separated from truth. The only way out is through literally working through the prison's corridors and puzzles, each one forcing him to confront another aspect of his guilt. This is where James encounters the abstract daddy, Angela's manifestation, and has to fight through her trauma to continue his own journey. This intersection of personal hells is psychologically significant. It shows that James is becoming aware that suffering isn't unique to him, that other people carry unbearable burdens too, that there are gradations of guilt and trauma, and everyone is doing their best to survive their own internal nightmares. Seeing Angela's pain, specifically the damage caused by her father's abuse, forces James to consider the damage he's caused, the ways his actions have contributed to someone else's suffering, even if he justified those actions to himself as mercy. The prison section ends with James descending deeper underground, going beneath the prison into tunnels that shouldn't exist, moving from literal incarceration into something more metaphorical and archetypal. He's descending into his unconscious mind, into the buried content that he's kept locked away in the deepest psychological cells. And this descent leads him to the Lakeview Hotel, the final and most psychologically important location in the game. The Lakeview Hotel is where James and Mary stayed during a vacation to Silent Hill before her illness. This was their special place, the location referenced in the Impossible letter, where they made happy memories together. For James, the hotel represents the last time their relationship was truly good, before sickness invaded and corrupted everything, before caretaking replaced intimacy, before love became burden, became resentment, became murder. Returning to the hotel is returning to the source, to the origin point of their relationship before it was tainted. But the hotel James encounters isn't the place he remembers. It's decayed, rotted, some rooms pristine, but others showing signs of fire damage and deterioration. This dual nature represents James's split memory of Mary and their relationship. Some memories are preserved perfectly, idealized, kept pristine through nostalgia. Other memories are damaged, corrupted by what came after, impossible to separate from the guilt and horror that followed. The hotel forces James to walk through rooms that trigger specific memories. A room where they spent their first night together. A room where they had a significant conversation. Each space is loaded with emotional significance, and moving through them is like moving through the archaeology of a relationship, layer by layer, memory by memory, getting closer to the truth that's been buried at the center. And at the center of the hotel, in a room that James is drawn to inevitably, is the videotape. The tape he found in the hospital but hasn't watched yet. The tape that contains the truth he's been avoiding since before the game even started. And when James finally plays that tape, when he finally watches what's on it, The full horror of what he's done comes crashing through all his defenses at once. The videotape shows Mary in a bed at what appears to be the Lakeview Hotel, though whether the actual murder took place there or this is symbolic representation of memory is deliberately ambiguous. What's clear is that this is their special place, now corrupted into the site of her death. Mary is in bad shape, clearly suffering, and James is there with her, holding a pillow. The tape shows what James has buried so completely that he convinced himself it happened 3 years ago instead of recently. It shows him smothering her with the pillow, shows him killing his wife, shows him committing the act he's built an entire false timeline to avoid remembering. And watching this tape, James finally breaks. The denial shatters. The repressed memory floods back. He remembers now. He remembers doing it, remembers the weight of the pillow, remembers Mary's final moments, remembers the silence after, the terrible silence of having done something that can never be undone. This is the moment of anagnorisis, the recognition scene, where the protagonist finally sees the truth they've been blind to. And for James, this recognition is devastating beyond measure because it means acknowledging that everything he believed about himself is a lie. He's not the grieving widower who lost his wife to illness 3 years ago. He's a killer who murdered his wife recently, within the past week or two, and then repressed the memory so completely that he reconstructed his entire history, moving the date of her death back 3 years to when she first became ill, creating a false timeline to avoid facing what he actually did. The James he thought he was doesn't exist. That version was fiction, protective delusion, a story he told himself to survive knowing what he'd done. And now that story has collapsed, and he's left standing in the ruins of his self-concept, with no defense against the full weight of his guilt. This moment in the Lakeview Hotel is the psychological climax of Silent Hill 2. Everything before this has been building to this recognition. Every monster fought, every location explored, every puzzle solved has been moving James closer to this moment of complete, undeniable truth. And now that he's here, now that he knows and can't unknow, the question becomes what happens next. Have you ever remembered something you'd buried so deep you'd convinced yourself it never happened? Maybe a humiliation you'd blocked out, a betrayal you'd erased, a moment of cruelty you'd told yourself was justified or wasn't that bad, and then something triggers the real memory and it comes back with full force, and you have to reconcile the person you thought you were with the person who actually did that thing. That cognitive dissonance is painful at small scales. At the scale James is experiencing, having repressed murder and rebuilt his entire personal history around that repression, the pain is annihilating. The hotel becomes a place of judgment after the videotape revelation. James has to confront manifestations of Mary in multiple forms. He encounters Maria, who we need to discuss in depth because she's crucial to understanding James's psychology, and he faces the final decision about who he is and what he deserves, which determines which ending the game presents. But before we get to those endings, we need to understand the other characters James meets in Silent Hill, because each one represents a different facet of guilt and trauma, different paths through horror, different ways of dealing with unbearable psychological burden. The others, mirrors of fractured psychology. James isn't alone in Silent Hill, and the people he encounters aren't random. Each character is drawn to the town by their own guilt and trauma, and each represents a different psychological response to unbearable circumstances. Understanding how James interacts with these characters reveals much about his own psychology and the choices available to him. Let's start with Angela Orozco. James first meets Angela in a cemetery, searching for her mother. She's young, probably late teens or early 20s. And there's something deeply broken about her from the first moment. She's fragile, dissociative, clearly traumatized. Through fragmented conversations and eventually confronting the abstract daddy, James learns that Angela was sexually abused by her father throughout her childhood. She eventually killed her father and possibly her brother, though the game keeps some details ambiguous, and fled to Silent Hill, drawn here by her trauma. Angela represents trauma as permanent damage, as wound so deep it can never fully heal. When James interacts with her, she's already mostly gone, already surrendered to her pain. She sees fire everywhere in Silent Hill because her internal experience is burning, consuming, destructive heat. The same locations that appear as rot and decay to James appear as flame to Angela because they're experiencing different manifestations of the same metaphysical space. Each person's Silent Hill customized to their specific psychological damage. The last time James sees Angela, she's walking up a burning staircase, and the implication is clear. She's choosing death, surrendering to her trauma, allowing it to consume her completely. She represents the path of giving up, of deciding that the pain is too much and the only escape is self destruction. James watching her disappear into fire is watching a possible version of his own future, the path he might take if he decides his guilt is unbearable and death is the only resolution. Angela's psychology shows what happens when guilt and trauma aren't just about one action, but about years of cumulative damage, about being victimized so repeatedly that your sense of self never formed correctly in the first place. She's not trying to recover a previous state of wholeness because she never had that wholeness to begin with. Her father stole it before she was old enough to establish psychological autonomy. So for her, there's no path back to health, only the question of how long she can continue existing with this level of pain before it finally destroys her. James's interactions with Angela are limited, but psychologically revealing. He tries to help her, offers concern, but ultimately can't reach her. This mirrors his inability to truly help Mary during her illness, his powerlessness in the face of another person's suffering. But it also shows James beginning to develop empathy, beginning to see outside his own psychological crisis, long enough to recognize someone else's pain. This empathy is crucial for his potential redemption. If he remains completely self-focused, he'll never be able to move past his guilt. But if he can recognize that suffering is universal, that others carry unbearable burdens too, he might find a framework for self-forgiveness. Then there's Eddie Dombrowski, who represents a very different response to guilt and trauma. Eddie is a large man who's been bullied his whole life about his weight, his appearance, his social awkwardness. He snapped at some point before coming to Silent Hill, possibly killing someone who mocked him, possibly killing multiple people. The details are unclear, but the violence is evident. Eddie came to Silent Hill fleeing consequences of his actions, and the town has trapped him in his own cycle of rage and victimhood. Where Angela is passive and self-destructive, Eddie is aggressive and externally destructive. He deals with his guilt by denying responsibility, by insisting that people who mocked him deserved what they got, that he's the real victim, that violence was justified self-defense against a world that's always been cruel to him. This is defensive grandiosity, where someone protects their fragile self-esteem by constructing a narrative where they're always right and everyone else is wrong, where any harm they cause was deserved by those they harmed. Eddie's psychology fascinates because it shows how guilt can be transmuted into rage, how someone can commit violence and then restructure their entire moral framework to avoid feeling bad about it. He's not repressing his actions like James. He remembers what he did, but he's reframed those actions from crimes to justice, from murder to righteous payback. This allows him to maintain self-esteem while engaging in increasingly violent behavior. James encounters Eddie multiple times, and each interaction shows Eddie's psychological deterioration. First, he's defensive but not openly hostile. Then he's agitated, paranoid, insisting people are laughing at him. Finally, he's fully psychotic, shooting corpses and real people indiscriminately, lost completely in his rage-fueled narrative. James has to kill Eddie in self-defense, and this is psychologically significant because it's James having to destroy a version of what he could become if he let anger and denial completely take over. Eddie represents the path of externalizing guilt, of blaming everyone else, of letting rage burn away any possibility of genuine remorse or growth. James killing Eddie is symbolically rejecting that path, acknowledging that he can't just blame Mary for being sick, or circumstances for being difficult, or society for not understanding. He has to own his actions, feel appropriate guilt, and find some way to live with that guilt that doesn't involve either destroying himself like Angela or destroying everyone around him like Eddie. Then there's Laura, the 8-year-old girl who was Mary's friend in the hospital. Laura is psychologically fascinating because she exists in Silent Hill but doesn't see the monsters or decay. She experiences the town as just a normal place, somewhat empty but not nightmarish. This is because Laura is innocent. She has no guilt or trauma for Silent Hill to manifest. She's just a child who misses her friend Mary and came looking for her. Laura's presence serves multiple psychological functions for James. First, she's a reminder of Mary's humanity, of the real person Mary was beyond James's guilt-distorted memories. Laura loved Mary, remembers her fondly, and this pure affection from a child who has no complicated feelings about Mary forces James to remember that Mary was a real person with value and worth, not just a source of burden or object of guilt. Second, Laura is openly hostile to James. She plays cruel tricks on him, locks him in rooms, clearly dislikes him, and eventually we learn why. Mary told Laura in her final days that James hadn't visited in a while, that he didn't really want to be there anymore. Laura picked up on Mary's pain at James' abandonment and hates him for hurting her friend. This is devastating for James because it means Mary was aware of his growing resentment and emotional distance, and was hurt by it. It means his feelings weren't as hidden as he thought, that Mary died knowing James didn't love her the same way anymore. Laura represents innocence confronting guilt, truth speaking to denial. She has no filter, no politeness, no reason to protect James's feelings. She just tells him directly, "You hurt Mary, you were a bad husband, Mary deserved better." And James can't argue because Laura is right. This external validation of his guilt, coming from someone with no agenda except loyalty to Mary, makes it harder for James to maintain any defensive structure around his actions. Finally, there's Maria, and she's the most psychologically complex character James encounters because Maria isn't real in the same way the others are. Maria is Silent Hill's creation, a manifestation designed specifically for James, embodying everything he wanted Mary to be but wasn't, especially during her illness. Maria looks almost exactly like Mary, but not quite. Her hair is blonde instead of brown, longer, styled differently. She wears revealing, provocative clothing where Mary dressed modestly. She's flirtatious, sexualized, healthy, vibrant, everything Mary couldn't be during her illness. Maria is fantasy Mary, the version James wished for while the real Mary was wasting away in a hospital bed. And here's the psychological cruelty of Maria's existence. James is attracted to her. He knows she looks like Mary, knows something is wrong with this situation, but he's drawn to her anyway because she represents desire without guilt, sexuality without caretaking burden, companionship without the weight of Mary's suffering. Maria is temptation, the possibility of having a version of his wife that doesn't come with all the trauma and guilt attached to the real person. But Silent Hill won't let James have this fantasy without consequence. Maria dies repeatedly throughout the game. James finds her, starts to trust her, begins to depend on her presence, and then she's killed, often by Pyramid Head, often in ways that force James to watch helplessly. And then she reappears, alive again, with no memory of dying, and the cycle continues. This repetitive trauma, watching Maria die over and over, is Silent Hill punishing James for wanting a replacement Mary, for wanting to erase the real woman and substitute a more convenient fantasy version. The psychology here cuts deep. Maria represents James's worst impulses, his desire to redo the past with Mary, but make her less complicated, his wish that Mary had been sexier and easier and less demanding, his fantasy of being with someone who looks like his wife but doesn't carry the baggage of their actual relationship. Every time Maria dies, it's James's fantasy dying, his denial being destroyed, his escape route being closed off. Silent Hill is saying, you don't get to replace Mary with a more convenient version. You don't get to fantasize your way out of guilt. You have to face what you did to the real person. There's a bonus scenario called Born from a Wish, where you play as Maria before she meets James, and it reveals that Maria has her own consciousness, her own awareness that she's not real, that she was created for a purpose. She knows she exists only for James, and this gives her an existential crisis. She's alive but not really, conscious but not autonomous, built to fulfill someone else's need but not certain she wants to fulfill that role. This adds tragic depth to Maria's character because she's not just a symbol. She's a being who knows she's a symbol and is trapped in that symbolic function. When James interacts with Maria, he's really interacting with his own desires and guilt. When he protects Maria, he's trying to protect the fantasy of uncomplicated love. When he watches her die, he's being forced to accept that you can't escape real trauma by constructing fantasy alternatives. When Maria eventually reveals that she knows things only Mary would know, that she has Mary's memories mixed with this sexualized persona, James has to confront that he's not dealing with two separate people, but with his own fragmented relationship with his wife, the Madonna whore split projected onto external reality. Maria asks James directly at one point, am I not good enough for you? I'm here, I'm real, I can be whatever you want. And this is the temptation in its purest form. Silent Hill is offering James a way out. Forget the real Mary and the guilt attached to her. Accept Maria, this fantasy version, and live in comfortable denial forever. But accepting Maria would mean abandoning Mary's memory completely, reducing her to a template that could be improved upon. And this is the moral test at the heart of James's psychology. Does he deserve to escape his guilt through fantasy? Does he honor Mary more by clinging to the flawed, complicated truth of their relationship, or by moving on to something easier? These questions don't have simple answers, and James's struggle with them is reflected in his confused, painful interactions with Maria, where he's drawn to her but also repulsed by his own attraction, protective but also hostile, unable to fully embrace or reject her because she represents impulses he can't quite acknowledge in himself. The other characters, then, serve as psychological mirrors and possible paths for James. Angela shows him self-destruction through surrender. Eddie shows him destruction of others through rage and denial. Laura shows him the innocence he's violated and the truth he's tried to hide. Maria shows him the temptation of fantasy and denial, the possibility of replacing real guilt with comfortable fiction, and how James responds to each of them, which paths he seems drawn to or repelled by, determines which ending he eventually receives, and which version of James Sunderland emerges from Silent Hill if he emerges at all. These interactions reveal that James is developing psychological awareness, slowly, painfully learning to see beyond his own immediate crisis. He shows compassion to Angela even when she's hostile. He recognizes Eddie's violence as wrong even while understanding the pain behind it. He accepts Laura's anger as deserved. He struggles with Maria in ways that show he's starting to understand that fantasy isn't solution. This developing awareness is crucial because it suggests James has the capacity for genuine growth, for moving beyond his guilt into something like redemption, even if that redemption is painful and incomplete. The revelation, memory restored, self destroyed. After James watches the videotape in the Lakeview Hotel, after he finally remembers killing Mary, the psychological dynamic of the game shifts completely. He can't hide anymore. He can't pretend he doesn't know what happened. The truth is out, exposed, undeniable, and now he has to decide what that truth means for who he is and what he does next. This is where the game's ending system comes into play, and the endings aren't just different outcomes, they're different psychological resolutions to James's trauma and guilt, different answers to the question, what does someone do when they've committed an unforgivable act and can't undo it? But before we explore those endings, we need to understand the full psychological weight of what James has just remembered. It's not just that he killed Mary, it's why he killed her and how he felt about it and what he did immediately after. The memory returns not as simple fact, but as complete sensory and emotional experience. He remembers being in the hotel room with her, hearing her labored breathing, seeing her suffering, and feeling relief, anticipatory relief that it would finally be over, relief mixed with love and grief and exhaustion and resentment all tangled together into something that felt unbearable. He remembers picking up the pillow. He remembers Mary seeing him with it, maybe understanding what was about to happen, or maybe not. The game leaves this ambiguous. He remembers pressing it over her face. He remembers her weak struggle, her body already so depleted that she couldn't fight effectively. He remembers the moment she stopped moving. He remembers lifting the pillow and seeing her face, peaceful now, finally free from pain. And he remembers his own reaction, not horror or immediate regret, but relief, deep, flooding relief that it was finally done, that the burden had finally been lifted. And then afterward the guilt came, not immediately but gradually, as the relief faded and the reality of what he'd done settled in. He'd killed his wife. He'd murdered someone who trusted him, who was helpless and dependent on his care. He'd violated every vow he'd ever made to her. He'd become something he couldn't recognize in the mirror, and the guilt was so overwhelming, so completely shattering to his identity, that his mind couldn't hold it, so it started rewriting history, conflating the date of her illness with the date of her death, eventually creating the false memory that she died 3 years ago when she first got sick, inventing memories of a funeral and a long bereavement process and gradual acceptance of her death from natural causes, none of which actually happened because she only died a week or so ago. This is psychogenic amnesia at its most extreme. Severity rating 5 out of 5. James didn't just forget a detail or misremember an event. He reconstructed his entire recent history, created false timeline and false memories to protect himself from truth so devastating that holding it consciously would have led to immediate psychological collapse. His mind chose survival over accuracy, fiction over fact, and built an elaborate delusion that allowed him to continue functioning day to day without facing what he'd done. But delusions are fragile. They require constant maintenance, constant energy devoted to keeping contradictions at bay. And something in James, some part of his psyche that couldn't live with this level of dishonesty, created the impossible letter and brought him to Silent Hill specifically to force the truth back into consciousness. This is the death drive in psychoanalytic terms, the part of the psyche that seeks dissolution, truth, ending, even when that truth is unbearable. James's journey to Silent Hill is really an elaborate suicide attempt, not of body, but of false self. He came here to destroy the fiction he's been living in, and now that the fiction is destroyed, he has to figure out how to exist in the truth. Have you ever told yourself a lie for so long that you started believing it was true? Maybe you convinced yourself you were happy in a miserable situation, or that you didn't care about something that was actually devastating you, or that you were fine when you were absolutely not fine. And then something happens that forces you to see reality clearly. And the gap between the lie you told yourself and the truth you were avoiding is so enormous that you don't know who you are anymore. That's where James is now. The gap between I lost my wife to illness 3 years ago and I'm a grieving widower, and I killed my wife recently and I'm a murderer who repressed the memory, is so vast that there's no bridge across it. The James who existed before the videotape and the James who exists after are functionally different people, and he has to somehow integrate them into coherent identity. This is the dark night of the soul in psychological and spiritual terms, the moment of complete ego death where everything you believed about yourself is revealed as false, and you're left with nothing but raw, undeniable truth about your own darkness. Some people don't survive this moment. The revelation is too much, the guilt too overwhelming, and they choose death as the only escape from unbearable self-knowledge. Others survive but remain broken, never fully recovering, carrying the wound forever. A few find some kind of redemption or transformation, using the revelation as catalyst for genuine change. But this path is the hardest because it requires holding enormous pain while still choosing to live and grow. James is at this crossroads. He knows what he did. He knows why he did it. He knows what it makes him. And now he has to choose. Does he give in to the guilt and seek death as punishment? Does he try to deny or minimize it even now? Does he accept it fully and try to find some way to live with it? The game's ending system reflects these different choices, different psychological resolutions to irresolvable moral crisis. But there's one more psychological revelation before we get to the endings. After James remembers the murder, he encounters Mary again, or at least a manifestation of Mary, and she delivers a letter to him, a real letter this time, not the impossible summons he came to Silent Hill following. This letter was written by Mary during her illness, possibly just before her death, and its contents are psychologically devastating because Mary forgives him. The letter says she's sorry for being difficult during her illness, sorry for the burden she became, sorry for the things she said in anger and pain. She says she knows James tried his best, that she understands how hard it was for him, that she doesn't blame him for anything. She says she loves him and wants him to be happy, to move on with his life, to find peace even though she's gone. It's a letter of love and absolution from the person James wronged most, and receiving it is psychologically complex. On one level, the letter offers James what he desperately needs: forgiveness from Mary, permission to forgive himself, release from the guilt that's been destroying him. If Mary herself doesn't blame him, if she understood his suffering too, then maybe what he did wasn't purely evil. Maybe it was mercy twisted up with selfishness, but still containing some love. Maybe he can frame it as understandable human failure rather than unforgivable crime. But on another level, the letter makes his guilt worse because it reminds him of Mary's humanity, her capacity for love and understanding even while suffering. It makes her real again instead of just a symbol of his guilt, and killing a real person who loved you and forgave you is somehow worse than killing the nightmarish burden she'd become in his mind during her final days. The letter restores Mary's full personhood, and that makes James's act of killing her that much more transgressive. There's also the question of whether the letter is even real. Is this actually a letter Mary wrote, or is it another manifestation from Silent Hill, giving James what he psychologically needs to move towards some form of resolution? The game never clarifies definitively which is intentional. The ambiguity reflects the fact that forgiveness and redemption are psychological states as much as external realities. Whether Mary actually forgave James matters less than whether James can internalize a sense of forgiveness enough to continue living without destroying himself. This is the psychological landscape James inhabits as he moves toward the game's conclusion. He knows what he did. He carries Mary's forgiveness, whether earned or manifested. He's seen the various paths of other guilty people in Silent Hill. He's confronted the monsters of his own psyche and survived. Now he has to choose what kind of person he is and what his guilt demands from him. The choice determines the ending, and each ending represents a different psychological resolution to trauma and guilt. The ending psychological resolution, Silent Hill 2, has multiple endings, and which one players receive depends on subtle choices throughout the game. How often did James heal himself? How often did he look at Mary's photo? How much time did he spend protecting Maria? How much damage did he take? Did he spend time reading Mary's letter? These seemingly minor actions accumulate into a psychological profile that determines which ending James has earned, which resolution his psychological state leads toward naturally. Let's go through each ending and what it represents psychologically. The leave ending is often considered the good ending, though good is a complicated word for this game. In this ending, James fully accepts his guilt. He acknowledges that he killed Mary, admits the mix of mercy and selfishness in his motivations, and accepts that he can never undo what he's done. But he also accepts Mary's forgiveness, internalizes her final letter's message that she wanted him to be happy, and makes the choice to leave Silent Hill and continue living despite his guilt. This is the path of genuine psychological growth and redemption. Severity rating for achieved insight 4 out of 5. James has done incredibly difficult psychological work. He's faced unbearable truth, integrated split off parts of his psyche, acknowledged his capacity for both love and violence. He's moved through denial to acceptance, through repression to memory, through fantasy to reality. And he's made the hardest choice, to live with guilt, to carry it permanently, but not to let it destroy him. In this ending, James leaves Silent Hill with Laura, the little girl who was Mary's friend. This is symbolically significant because it suggests James is taking responsibility for someone else, connecting to the part of Mary that continues existing in Laura's memory of her. He's not replacing Mary with Laura, but he's honoring Mary by caring for someone she loved. This outward focus, this willingness to continue engaging with life and relationships despite his guilt, suggests genuine psychological healing. Incomplete and painful but real. The leave ending represents what's possible when someone who's committed terrible acts takes full responsibility, does genuine work to understand their motivations, and chooses to move forward constructively despite carrying permanent guilt. It's not easy redemption or full absolution. James will never forget what he did, but he's chosen to live with that knowledge rather than be destroyed by it. And the choice itself is a form of redemption. The in-water ending is often considered the bad ending, though again, these moral labels simplify complex psychological dynamics. In this ending, James accepts his guilt, but decides it's unforgivable. He concludes that what he did to Mary places him beyond redemption, that the only appropriate response is to join her in death. He retrieves Mary's body from wherever he's kept it, places it in his car, and drives into Toluca Lake, drowning himself with her body beside him. This is the path of complete surrender to guilt. Severity rating for suicidality, 5 out of 5. This is actualized suicidal ideation turning into completed suicide. James has decided that his guilt is too great to live with, that he doesn't deserve the chance at continued life that he denied Mary. There's a twisted logic to this ending, a kind of moral consistency. If he believes he deserves death for what he did, then enacting that death himself is taking responsibility for his own judgment. But psychologically, this ending represents failure to integrate trauma, inability to find meaning in continued existence after moral injury. It's the guilt winning completely, overwhelming every other consideration, making life itself seem like inappropriate escape from deserved punishment. James, in this ending, has done the psychological work of remembering and acknowledging his guilt, but he can't do the next step of finding a way to live with it. The pain is too much, the self loathing too complete, and death seems like the only honest response. The in water ending is what happens when someone's moral framework is rigid enough that transgression seems unforgivable even by the self, when guilt becomes a black hole that swallows every possibility of joy or purpose or continued meaning. It's tragic because James has achieved psychological insight without achieving psychological resilience. He knows the truth but can't bear it. The Maria ending represents a different failure, the failure to truly accept guilt at all. In this ending, James rejects Mary's memory, rejects the full weight of his guilt, and chooses Maria instead. He leaves Silent Hill with Maria, this fantasy version of his wife, essentially choosing comfortable delusion over painful truth. He's decided that if he can have a version of Mary without all the trauma attached, that's preferable to facing reality. But the ending includes a sting. As James and Maria leave town, Maria starts coughing, just like Mary did at the beginning of her illness. The implication is clear. James hasn't escaped anything. He's going to repeat the whole cycle with Maria, and when she gets sick and becomes difficult, he'll kill her too, and then repress that memory, and on and on. This is the eternal return of unresolved psychological trauma, the way patterns repeat until you actually face and heal them. Psychologically, the Maria ending represents defensive avoidance, the choice to retreat into fantasy rather than do the hard work of integration. Severity rating for ongoing denial, 5 out of 5. James has had every opportunity to face truth, has been forced to remember what he did, and has chosen to ignore that truth anyway in favor of more comfortable fiction. This is the path of someone who learns nothing, who continues making the same mistakes, who will hurt people again because they refuse to acknowledge they hurt people before. This ending is particularly cruel because it suggests James has learned to be more efficient at denial. He's lived through Silent Hill's entire process of forcing him toward truth, and he's still chosen fantasy. That suggests deep pathology, a commitment to avoiding reality that's more powerful than any therapeutic intervention Silent Hill could provide. The Maria ending is psychological stagnation dressed up as moving forward. The rebirth ending is one of the more obscure endings requiring specific actions to unlock. In this ending, James collects occult items throughout Silent Hill and performs a ritual at the lake, attempting to use the town's supernatural properties to resurrect Mary. He believes that if he can bring her back to life, he can undo his guilt, make everything right again, return to the way things were before. This ending represents magical thinking and the fantasy of undoing irrevocable acts. Psychologically, it's regression to primitive modes of thought where intention and ritual can change material reality, where consequences can be reversed through proper symbolic action. It's denial, but of a different flavor than the Maria ending. Instead of replacing Mary with a fantasy version, James is trying to retrieve the real Mary through impossible means. The psychology here is desperate bargaining, the stage of grief where you try to negotiate with reality or fate or God to change what's already happened. If I just do the right things, perform the right ritual, maybe this can all be undone. It's the child's belief that wishing hard enough can make things so. James, in this ending, has regressed psychologically to a state where he can accept permanent consequences, where death isn't final, where guilt can be erased by bringing the victim back. This ending is particularly sad because it shows James so unable to live with what he's done that he's willing to embrace obvious delusion. The ritual won't work, Mary won't come back, but James attempting it anyway reveals the depth of his desperation, his complete inability to move forward in reality, his psychological need for escape that's even stronger than his connection to what's actually possible. The UFO ending is intentionally comedic, breaking the fourth wall and not meant to be taken as genuine psychological resolution. It exists as relief, a way for players who've experienced the game's heavy psychological horror to laugh and release tension. In psychological terms, humor is a mature defense mechanism, a healthy way of dealing with difficult emotions. The UFO ending functions as that release valve, acknowledging that sometimes you need to step back from darkness and just laugh at absurdity. Each ending, then, except the joke ending, represents a different psychological outcome for someone who's committed a terrible act and been forced to face it: growth and painful redemption, complete surrender to guilt, retreat into fantasy, desperate magical thinking. None of the endings are purely happy because there's no way for James's story to resolve happily. Mary is dead. He killed her. That fact is permanent and can't be undone or made okay. The only question is how James lives with that fact, and each ending shows a different answer. The genius of Silent Hill 2's design is that the ending you receive reflects how you played, what you focused on, where you directed James's attention. If you constantly healed James, looked at Mary's photo, spent time with her letter, you're keeping Mary central in his psychology and moving toward the leave ending. If you let James stay damaged, rarely healed, you're expressing death drive and moving toward the in-water ending. If you protected Maria obsessively, spent time with her, prioritized her safety, you're feeding James's fantasy and moving toward the Maria ending. The game makes you complicit in James's psychology. Your choices as players shape his psychological resolution. You're not just watching James work through trauma. You're actively determining how he works through it by how you direct his attention and actions. This creates unique psychological engagement where the player has to consider, what do I think James deserves? What do I think he should do? And in answering those questions about a fictional character, you're necessarily engaging with your own beliefs about guilt, redemption, punishment, and the possibility of moving forward after committing terrible acts. The deeper horror, what Silent Hill 2 says about human psychology. Let's step back from James specifically and talk about what Silent Hill 2 achieves psychologically as a work of horror and art. This game isn't about zombies or serial killers or external threats. It's about the horror of being human, of having a mind that can protect you from unbearable truths through denial and repression. But that protection always fails eventually, and the reckoning is worse for having been delayed. The game understands something profound about guilt. It doesn't diminish with time or repression. It grows, it metastasizes. It finds ways to express itself through symptoms and dreams and behavioral patterns even when you've forgotten the original cause. James tried to handle his guilt through complete repression, and that repression itself became a form of torture, requiring enormous psychological energy to maintain, creating fractures in his sense of reality, ultimately drawing him to Silent Hill precisely because he couldn't sustain the repression any longer. This is actually how trauma and guilt work in real psychology. You can push things out of conscious awareness, but you can't eliminate them from your psyche. They remain active in your unconscious, influencing your feelings and behaviors and perceptions in ways you don't fully understand. Therapy, genuine psychological healing, requires making the unconscious conscious, facing what's been buried, integrating split off parts of the self. That's exactly what Silent Hill forces James to do. Just through nightmare metaphor instead of therapeutic dialogue, the game also understands that monsters aren't really the threat. The monsters in Silent Hill 2 are dangerous, sure, but they're symptoms, not cause. The real threat is James himself, his own guilt and self destructive impulses, his capacity for both murder and denial. Every monster he fights is really a fight with himself. Every location he explores is really his own memory. Every puzzle he solves is really an insight about his own psychology. The entire game is internal, even though it's presented as external exploration and combat. This is why Silent Hill 2 remains psychologically powerful decades after release. It's not using psychology as window dressing or using mental illness as cheap scare tactic. It's genuinely exploring how minds break under unbearable moral weight, how we protect ourselves from our own worst actions, how truth demands acknowledgement even when acknowledgement means destroying everything we believe about who we are. The game is compassionate toward James, even as it refuses to excuse him. It shows us his desperation during Mary's illness, lets us feel his exhaustion and confusion and grief. It helps us understand how someone could reach the point of killing a suffering spouse not from evil, but from human weakness and breaking point reached. But it also insists that understanding doesn't equal excusing, that James still bears full responsibility for his choice to kill rather than finding other ways to cope with the unbearable situation. This moral complexity is rare in media. Usually we get villains who are purely evil or victims who are purely sympathetic. James is neither. He's a person who did terrible thing for understandable reasons, which makes him more psychologically realistic than most fictional characters. Real people who commit serious wrongs usually aren't monsters. They're ordinary people who broke under pressure, who made terrible choices at their worst moments, who have to figure out how to live with themselves afterward. Silent Hill 2 asks us to sit with that moral complexity without resolving it into simple judgment. Is James redeemable? The game doesn't answer definitively. It depends on how he responds to what he's done, how he chooses to move forward, what he does with his insight and guilt. Redemption isn't a state you achieve and then it's done. It's an ongoing practice of living consciously with your worst actions and trying to be better anyway. Have you ever thought about what you would do if you committed an unforgivable act? Not in fantasy, not in some scenario where you had good reasons that made it okay, but actually violating your deepest moral principles in a moment of weakness or rage or desperation. Could you forgive yourself? Could you live with yourself? Or would the guilt be so overwhelming that death seemed like the only honest response? These are the questions Silent Hill 2 forces players to consider, and there are no easy answers. The game's genius is creating a space where these questions can be explored experientially, not just intellectually. By the time you reach the endings, you've spent hours guiding James through his psychological hell. You fought his monsters, explored his memories, watched him slowly remember the truth. You're invested in his psychology in ways that pure narrative or abstract discussion couldn't achieve. And so the question of what James deserves, what he should do next, hits with real emotional weight. This is trauma theory and moral philosophy delivered through gameplay mechanics and environmental storytelling and symbolic monster design. It's psychology as horror and horror as psychological insight. Silent Hill 2 understands that the scariest thing isn't what might be hiding in the fog, it's what might be hiding in your own mind, in the parts of yourself you don't want to look at, in the memories you've buried so deep you've forgotten they exist. And for James Sunderland, ordinary man in a green jacket, unremarkable clerk who committed an extraordinary crime, the journey through Silent Hill is the journey everyone who's carrying unbearable guilt has to take eventually. You can't run forever. You can't hide from yourself indefinitely. Eventually, the truth catches up, and when it does, you have to decide, will this truth destroy me, or will I find some way, however painful, to integrate it and continue living? That's the question at the heart of James's psychology and Silent Hill 2's horror. And the game's lasting power comes from its refusal to answer that question for you, instead placing you in James's position and asking, what would you do? What do you think someone in this position deserves? What's the path forward when there's no good path, only different flavors of painful continuation or surrender to guilt's demands? These are the questions that make Silent Hill 2 more than just a horror game. They make it a genuine exploration of human psychology at its most vulnerable, most broken, most desperately searching for redemption or at least understanding. James Sunderland isn't just a character. He's a case study in how minds fracture under moral weight, how guilt manifests when repressed, how truth demands acknowledgement, and how the only path through psychological hell is straight through the center, facing every horror until there's nothing left to hide from. And that's the full psychological analysis of James Sunderland, a man who killed his wife, repressed the memory so completely he rewrote his own history, journeyed into a nightmare town that manifested his guilt as external reality, and slowly, painfully, through monster and memory and metaphor, remembered what he'd done and had to choose what that truth meant for who he could be going forward. It's horror, it's psychology, it's tragedy, it's possibly redemption. It's one of the most psychologically complex narratives gaming has ever produced, and James Sunderland remains one of the most realistic portrayals of guilt and trauma horror has ever created. That's who James Sunderland is, psychologically speaking. That's what Silent Hill 2 achieves in its exploration of his fractured mind. And that's why, decades later, this quiet man in a green jacket still haunts players who experienced his journey through fog and monster and memory toward the unbearable truth waiting at the center of his own psyche. The symbolic language, how Silent Hill speaks psychology. Before we conclude, we need to discuss how Silent Hill 2 communicates its psychological themes through symbolism, environmental design, and gameplay mechanics. This game doesn't just tell a story about trauma and guilt. It makes you feel those states through every aspect of its design. Understanding this symbolic language deepens the psychological analysis because it shows how thoroughly the game has integrated psychology into its very structure. The fog itself is the most obvious and pervasive symbol. Fog obscures vision, makes it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, creates disorientation and uncertainty. Psychologically, this represents the obscurity James has placed over his own memories and motivations. He can't see clearly because he's actively preventing himself from seeing clearly. The fog is his denial made atmospheric, his repression made environmental. Every step through that fog is a step through his own clouded consciousness, trying to navigate toward truth when truth has been deliberately hidden. And notice that the fog varies in thickness throughout the game. Sometimes it's so dense you can barely see James himself. Other times it lifts slightly, allowing more visibility. This correlates with James's psychological state at different points in his journey. When he's closest to remembering something crucial, when his defenses are weakening, the fog thins. When he's most defended, most deeply in denial, the fog becomes impenetrable. The environment is literally responding to his internal psychological processes. Then there's the rust and decay that covers everything in Silent Hill's otherworld sections. Buildings rot, walls bleed, metal corrodes, everything is in a state of advanced deterioration. This represents the corruption eating away at James's psyche from the inside. Guilt and repressed trauma don't just sit dormant, they poison everything they touch. The rust spreading across surfaces mirrors how James's guilt has spread through every aspect of his consciousness, tainting memories, corrupting perceptions, making everything feel contaminated and wrong. The transition between the normal, foggy Silent Hill and the rusted, nightmarish otherworld is particularly psychologically significant. The shifts happen suddenly, without warning, the world around James literally transforming into grotesque parody of itself. This represents dissociative states, moments when James's grip on constructed reality slips and the underlying horror breaks through. People with severe trauma often experience reality as unstable, moments where the world feels fundamentally wrong or threatening, even when nothing external has changed. The otherworld transitions are that feeling made literal. Water and bodies of water appear constantly throughout Silent Hill 2, and they carry deep symbolic weight. Toluca Lake is where James's car eventually ends up in the in-water ending. Water represents the unconscious in Jungian psychology, the deep unknown parts of psyche, where repressed content lives. James is constantly near water, walking along lakeside, navigating through flooded areas, because he's navigating the boundary between conscious awareness and unconscious repression. Going into the water would mean drowning in his unconscious content, being overwhelmed by everything he's been keeping buried. And in the suicide ending, that's exactly what happens. The hotel itself, the Lakeview Hotel where James and Mary stayed, and where the crucial videotape waits, is positioned right on the lake. This is geographically and symbolically perfect. The hotel is the site of the murder, the place where James crossed the line from thought to action, and it sits right at the boundary between land, consciousness, and water, unconscious. Returning to the hotel means returning to that boundary, to the moment where everything changed, and potentially crossing over into the unconscious depths where full truth waits. The mirrors throughout the game are another powerful symbol. James encounters mirrors repeatedly, and what he sees in them varies. Sometimes it's his normal reflection. Sometimes the reflection is distorted or disturbing. Sometimes mirrors are cracked or obscured. Mirrors represent self-perception, the ability to see yourself accurately. A clear mirror means honest self-knowledge. A distorted or broken mirror means fragmented or false self-perception. James's relationship with mirrors throughout the game tracks his relationship with self-knowledge. Early on, he avoids them or sees false reflections. By the end, he has to look clearly at who he actually is, not who he wants to believe he is. The game's save points are red squares marked on the ground in various locations. You have to consciously choose to approach them and save your progress. Psychologically, these represent moments of integration, points where James has to acknowledge where he is and what he's experienced, solidifying it into accepted reality before he can move forward. The act of saving is the act of accepting that, yes, this is real, this is happening. I need to mark this point in my journey because I'm committing to continuing from here. It's a small thing, but it reinforces the theme that progress requires acknowledgement and integration, not just forward motion. The puzzles deserve special attention because they're not just gameplay obstacles, they're psychological barriers James has to work through. Every puzzle represents something locked in his psyche that requires effort and insight to access. Finding keys, decoding riddles, manipulating objects into correct positions, all of this symbolizes the cognitive work required to unlock repressed memories and integrate dissociated parts of the self. You can't just walk through Silent Hill. You have to solve it, figure it out, work through each layer of symbolic complexity before you can proceed. This mirrors therapeutic work, where insight and integration require active effort, not just passive waiting for improvement. Some puzzles specifically relate to Mary and James's relationship: the music box puzzle, the letter puzzle, puzzles involving rings or photographs or personal items. These require James to engage with memories and symbols of their life together, to handle representations of their relationship in order to progress. He can't just ignore Mary or push thoughts of her aside. He has to actively work through his feelings and memories, piece by piece, to move forward. The gameplay mechanics enforce the psychological truth that you can't heal by avoiding, you have to engage. The combat system is deliberately clunky and difficult. James is not good at fighting. His movements are slow, his aim is poor, his weapons are improvised and ineffective. This creates a sense of vulnerability and desperation that serves the psychological themes. James isn't a warrior having adventures. He's an ordinary person way out of his depth, barely surviving encounters that he's not equipped to handle. This mechanical awkwardness keeps players feeling James's psychological state: overwhelmed, underprepared, constantly on the verge of being destroyed by forces he doesn't fully understand. And crucially, you can run from most monsters. You don't have to fight everything. Sometimes the best option is to just flee, conserve resources, avoid confrontation. This creates interesting psychological dynamic where players have to choose: do I fight this manifestation of James's guilt, or do I run from it? Both options are valid, and the choice reflects approach to dealing with difficult psychological content. Sometimes you need to confront things directly. Sometimes you need to preserve your energy and avoid unnecessary conflict. The game allows both, which creates more nuanced psychological experience than if fighting was mandatory. The radio James carries produces static when monsters are nearby. It's an early warning system that something dangerous is approaching. Psychologically, this represents anxiety, the internal alarm system that activates when threat is detected. People with PTSD or severe anxiety often experience their nervous system as hyperactive, constantly scanning for danger, alerting them to potential threats even when they're safe. James's radio doing this constantly keeps him and the player in state of heightened vigilance, never fully relaxing, always anticipating the next attack. This is what it feels like to live with severe trauma: constant alertness, constant readiness for horror, inability to fully rest because you never know when danger will emerge. The darkness is another crucial element. Much of Silent Hill 2 takes place in very dark environments where James needs a flashlight to see. The flashlight creates a small circle of visibility in vast darkness, meaning you're always aware of how much you can't see, how much unknown space surrounds you. This is psychological reality for someone dealing with repressed trauma. You have small area of conscious awareness surrounded by vast unconscious unknown, and you're constantly aware that something could emerge from that darkness at any moment. The flashlight doesn't eliminate the darkness. It just creates temporary, limited visibility within overwhelming obscurity. All of these design choices work together to create psychological experience, not just psychological story. You don't just watch James deal with trauma, you feel elements of that trauma through gameplay. The disorientation, the limited visibility, the constant threat, the need to solve complex problems while under stress, the clumsy combat, the darkness, the decay, all of it contributes to psychological state that mirrors what James is experiencing internally. This is remarkable achievement in game design, using mechanics and environment to create empathy and understanding for a psychological state rather than just depicting it narratively. The broader implications, what James teaches us about ourselves. Let's talk about why James Sunderland matters beyond being a fascinating fictional case study. What does his story teach us about real human psychology, about how people deal with guilt and trauma, about the possibility of redemption after terrible acts? First, James's story illustrates how powerful denial and repression can be. We like to think we know ourselves, that we're conscious of our motivations and honest about our past. But James shows how the mind can completely rewrite history to protect itself from unbearable truth. He didn't just forget killing Mary, he created elaborate false timeline, false memories of her death occurring years earlier, false grief narrative that felt real to him. This is extreme, but it's not unprecedented in psychology. People with severe trauma sometimes develop false memories, create alternate versions of events, fragment their timelines. The mind's primary goal is survival, and sometimes survival requires lying to yourself so effectively that you believe the lie completely. This should be humbling for all of us. If James could be so fundamentally wrong about his own recent past, what might any of us be wrong about? What narratives have we constructed that feel true but might be protective fiction? What do we believe about ourselves that we've never questioned deeply enough to test against reality? James' extreme case reminds us that self-knowledge is fragile, easily distorted, and that being honest with ourselves requires constant effort and willingness to examine uncomfortable possibilities. Second, James's story explores the psychology of caregiving and its dark sides. We romanticize caregiving, treat it as purely noble and selfless. But James shows the reality. Caregiving for a terminally ill loved one is exhausting, depleting, emotionally devastating work that can breed resentment alongside love. The game doesn't excuse James's ultimate action, but it acknowledges the psychological pressure that led to it. 3 years of watching someone you love deteriorate. 3 years of being needed constantly while your own needs go unmet. 3 years of knowing there's no hope and no end except death. That breaks people. It changes them. It makes them think thoughts they never believed they were capable of thinking. Understanding this doesn't mean excusing mercy killings or saying caregivers are justified in harming those they care for. It means acknowledging that we need better support system for caregivers, better resources for people dealing with impossible situations, more honest conversations about the psychological toll of long-term caregiving. James's story is fictional, but the stresses he experienced are real, and people deal with them every day. Some of those people reach breaking points. Some of them make terrible choices. Pretending this doesn't happen doesn't prevent it. Honest acknowledgement and support prevents it. Third, James's journey illustrates that guilt, when severe enough, becomes its own form of psychological imprisonment. He can't escape his guilt because it's internal. It travels with him wherever he goes. It manifests in every environment, transforms neutral spaces into reminders of his transgression. This is what severe guilt does. It colonizes consciousness, makes everything relate back to the shameful act, prevents genuine engagement with present reality because you're always stuck in the past, reliving what you did, punishing yourself mentally. Many people live with less extreme but still significant guilt that functions similarly. Guilt over how they treated a parent before they died, guilt over a relationship they sabotaged, guilt over choices that harmed others. That guilt colors everything, makes joy feel undeserved, success feel illegitimate, love feel like a betrayal of the person they harmed. James' guilt made manifest as monsters, and other worlds is just a dramatic version of what guilt does to everyone. It creates internal horror that won't rest until it's addressed. The path through guilt, as Silent Hill 2 illustrates, isn't around it or over it, it's through it. James can't defeat his guilt by fighting Pyramid Head. He can't escape it by choosing Maria. He can't undo it by trying to resurrect Mary. The only paths that lead anywhere are full acknowledgement and acceptance, followed by either self-destruction if the guilt is judged unbearable, or continued life with permanent awareness of what he did if he can find a way to live with it. Most therapeutic approaches to pathological guilt suggest similar path. Acknowledge fully what you did, accept responsibility without defensiveness, feel appropriate remorse, and then make conscious choice to either let guilt destroy you or to live with it while trying to do better going forward. Fourth, James' story reminds us that people who do terrible things are still people, not monsters. It would be easier if murderers were completely different from us, if we could identify them as fundamentally other, separate category of being that we could never belong to. But James is ordinary. He's tired and confused and overwhelmed. He makes a terrible choice in a moment of extreme stress, and then he has to live with what he's done. This is more psychologically realistic than most depictions of people who commit serious harm. Understanding this doesn't mean excusing harm or being soft on consequences. It means recognizing that people who do wrong are still operating from human psychology, still responding to recognizable stresses and impulses, still capable of remorse and change. This perspective is necessary for genuine rehabilitation, for any approach to justice that includes possibility of redemption. If we treat everyone who commits serious wrong as permanently monstrous, we eliminate any path forward for them except continued harm or self-destruction. James's story, in allowing us to understand his psychology without excusing his action, models how we might hold these tensions: full acknowledgement of harm done, full accountability, and also recognition of humanity and possibility for something other than simple punishment. Have you ever done something you deeply regret? Something that, when you think about it, makes you question who you are and whether you're a good person? Most people have some version of this experience, even if not at James's extreme level. And how you deal with that regret, how you integrate it into your sense of self, how you move forward while carrying knowledge of your own capacity for harm. That's the work James is doing throughout Silent Hill 2. His extreme situation illuminates the process we all go through at smaller scales, confronting our own darkness, accepting it as ours, and deciding what to do with that knowledge. Finally, James's story explores whether redemption is possible after unforgivable acts, and it doesn't provide easy answer. The leave ending suggests yes, redemption is possible through full acknowledgement, genuine remorse, and commitment to living differently going forward. The in water ending suggests no. Some acts are so transgressive that the only appropriate response is self destruction. The Maria ending suggests that some people will choose comfortable lies over difficult redemption. And the rebirth ending suggests that some people will retreat into magical thinking rather than face reality. The game offers all these possibilities because there isn't one correct answer. Different people, different moral frameworks, different psychological constitutions will lead to different conclusions about what someone like James deserves and what he should do. The game respects players enough to let them grapple with these questions themselves rather than imposing a definitive moral judgment. This is sophisticated psychological and ethical storytelling, presenting a genuinely difficult moral situation and allowing space for multiple valid responses rather than insisting there's one right answer. Conclusion: The Man in the Mirror. So, what do we make of James Sunderland ultimately? Who is this quiet man in the green jacket who walked into fog and monsters and memory to confront the worst thing he's ever done? James is a portrait of human fragility and human resilience existing simultaneously. He's someone who broke under unbearable pressure and committed an unforgivable act. And he's also someone who couldn't live with what he'd done and undertook a dangerous psychological journey to face it. He's both murderer and mourner, both perpetrator and victim of his own guilt, both ordinary man and monster in human form. He's all of these things at once because people are complicated, capable of both great harm and genuine remorse, often within the same moment. His psychology is marked by extreme defense mechanisms: denial, repression, dissociation, all deployed to protect himself from truth too devastating to face directly. But those defenses fail, as extreme defenses always eventually do, and when they fail, James has to confront everything he's been hiding from himself. This process is agonizing, literally nightmarish, but it's also necessary. He can't heal, can't move forward, can't become anyone other than the person he's been until he faces full truth of what he did and why. The monsters James fights are really aspects of himself he's been running from. The locations he explores are really memories he's been avoiding. The puzzles he solves are really psychological barriers he has to work through, and the ending he receives depends on how he responds to this forced confrontation with his own darkness. Does he integrate it and move forward? Does he let it destroy him? Does he retreat back into denial? Or does he try to escape through impossible means? James Sunderland matters as a character because he's one of the most psychologically realistic portrayals of guilt, trauma, and moral injury in any medium. He's not a simple villain or tragic hero. He's a person who did terrible things for complicated reasons and then has to figure out how to exist afterward. His journey through Silent Hill is really a journey through the landscape of his own mind, and watching that journey, playing through it, forces engagement with difficult questions about guilt, responsibility, redemption, and the limits of self-knowledge. The genius of Silent Hill 2 is that it takes all these complex psychological concepts: repression, dissociation, symbolic manifestation, moral injury, complicated grief, suicidal ideation, motivated reasoning, and translates them into experiential gameplay. You don't just learn about these concepts, you feel them through mechanics and environment and symbolic storytelling. By the time you reach the endings, you've spent hours in James's psychological space, navigating his guilt and trauma firsthand, and the question of what he deserves hits differently because you've experienced something analogous to his internal journey, And maybe that's the deepest psychological achievement of James's character. He creates empathy for someone who committed an unforgivable act. Not sympathy, not excusing, but understanding. You can comprehend how someone gets to that point, how layers of stress and grief and resentment can accumulate until a terrible choice becomes thinkable, and then doable, and then something you have to live with forever. James doesn't let us off the hook by being obviously evil or clearly insane. He's uncomfortably normal, which means any of us could potentially become some version of him if circumstances aligned badly enough and support failed completely enough. That's uncomfortable truth, but it's truth nonetheless. We're all capable of more harm than we like to believe. We all have breaking points. We all engage in some level of denial and self deception to maintain tolerable self image. James' extreme case illuminates these universal psychological realities, making them visible through horror and symbol and nightmare journey through fog shrouded town. So when you look at James Sunderland standing in front of that bathroom mirror at the game's beginning, what are you seeing? You're seeing someone about to confront themselves completely, about to take a journey through their own mind's darkest corners, about to face truths they've buried so deep they've forgotten they exist. You're seeing someone who will be destroyed and rebuilt, who will have every defense stripped away, who will be forced to see themselves clearly for the first time in years, possibly for the first time ever. And depending on how they handle that confrontation, depending on what they choose, when all the denial is gone and only raw truth remains, they'll either emerge transformed or they won't emerge at all. That's James Sunderland. That's his psychology. That's why his story continues to resonate decades after Silent Hill 2's release. Because anyone who's ever felt crushing guilt, anyone who's ever committed acts they're ashamed of, anyone who's ever wondered if they're fundamentally good person despite having done bad things, everyone who's ever struggled with these questions can see something of themselves in James's journey. He's a man who killed his wife, repressed the memory, walked into psychological hell to remember, and then had to decide if he could live with what he'd learned. He's guilt made flesh, denial made journey, trauma made town. He's every uncomfortable question about human nature and moral injury and the possibility of redemption after unforgivable acts, all wrapped in the form of an ordinary man in a green jacket who looks exactly like someone you'd pass on the street without a second glance. And that ordinariness is the point. The monster isn't special. The killer isn't other. The person capable of terrible things looks exactly like everyone else. Like you, like me, like anyone on their worst day, when everything breaks at once. James Sunderland is horror made human, and his psychological journey through Silent Hill is really a journey we're all taking in smaller ways every day. The journey toward honest self knowledge, toward accepting our own capacity for both good and harm, toward living consciously with our own darkness instead of repressing it until it manifests as symptoms and suffering. That's the full psychological analysis. That's who James is, why he matters, what his story teaches us about guilt and trauma and the strange, complicated psychology of being human in a world where terrible things happen, and sometimes we're the ones making them happen. Silent Hill 2 isn't just a horror game, it's a masterclass in psychological depth, a meditation on guilt and redemption, and a character study of someone grappling with the worst version of himself in an environment that won't let him look away. James Sunderland will continue haunting players not because he's a monster, but because he's not. He's just a person who broke, and any of us could break given the wrong circumstances and enough pressure and no support when we needed it most. That's the deepest horror Silent Hill 2 offers. Not the monsters in the fog, but the recognition that the real monster might be looking back at you from the mirror, wearing your face, living your life, hiding truths you've buried so deep you've convinced yourself they never happened. James Sunderland found his truth. The question the game leaves you with is, would you have the courage to find yours?